Hello, everyone. Hello. I think it's time for us to start. And I'm Adriaan de Jongh. Who are you?
My name is Franz.
And we will be talking a little bit about getting started with editor tools. We don't necessarily want to make a talk here about like how to do it specifically. We just want to show a bunch of things. And hopefully gives you some ideas, because we think making your own tools can really empower you and enable specific workflows for your specific game or your specific tools. And honestly, it's quite easy to get started. It's also a bit daunting when you've never done one. So we're going to show you a couple of tools that we've made that were all relatively easy, that have enabled workflows for us. And these are in particular for two games, Rift and the still unannounced sequel to Hidden Folks. So first off, Godot already has a lot of tools and functionality built in. So even if they're suboptimal, it's still worth considering whether your workflow can be changed a bit so that you can just continue to work with the default stuff. I think this is very necessary to say at the start, because we're going to talk about tools and making your own tools, and it does also get me very excited. But always think, can I just make a slight modification to my workflow so that the default stuff works? Because custom tools, even though they can really empower you, they can also help you create a complex dependency, or a house of cards may contain bugs, maybe they need to be maintained, etc. So yeah, we think you're thinking about this waterfall of thinking should be along the lines of, can I do this thing that you need without tool scripts? Can I maybe do it with a simple tool button? Can I do it maybe with an add-on from the asset store? Can I do it with a custom plugin/editor tool? Or do I need to actually dive in the C++ code to change the core? But now we're exiting tools land. So some examples of no plugins are things like this nice inspector for curves and export annotations like export exp easing. This is all stuff that's built in, and initially you might think, oh, I need to build some sort of interface for this, but then you discover that it's already part of Godot. Same for a bunch of these options in the context menu, the right mouse click menu. If you click on a node in the scene tree, there's options like reparent to new node, which is the kind of thing that you might actually make a tool for, or it comes up in your mind to make a tool for, but it's already built in. And there is also some tools that are scene specific, like the nav mesh baking. And there's obviously a lot more features that I'm not talking about here. But that's a bit the kinds of things that are already baked in that, yeah, you have to search for a little bit. Okay, Frans.
Okay, now we're going to enter tool land. And by that, I mean by adding the @tool little line at the top of your script. So that basically just means that your script will then be runnable in the editor rather than just at runtime. And it comes with strengths, but also some problems, which we'll get into. But the first one we'll go to is a very simple one, @export tool button. It basically just gives you a tool button in your inspector, a little button, and then you click that button and it'll execute some code. Very simple, very straightforward, and it basically will do many, many things. And if you don't require some direct feedback, you can use it for probably most of the things that you need. Here's an example that we had. So in Hidden Folks, there's potentially thousands of these little figures that do very, very simple animations. Now, the animation player we thought was a little bit too heavy for all those people being animated, and especially since the animations were so simple. But we didn't want to lose the functionality, the nice UI of the animation player. So we built a system where we could basically animate using the animation player, then click a button to suck all that animation data out of it and pop it into a file, and then we animate it directly using the rendering server and draw calls. And next. Another example here is we actually use custom trigger areas to detect where you click on the screen, and most of the time it's just a very computationally cheap circle. But sometimes in a shape like this one, nice and tall, a circle would be way too big. So we developed a button that was this auto-generate shape, and it would look at the texture shape and create a polygon around that automatically. And then you could edit the polygon. And from there, you could adjust it however you wanted to create exactly the shape you want. And then you finish editing, and voila, you have your shape.
Another example was in Riff, where the way that we would design levels was first make a little a polygon. That would be sort of the base where the player would be able to walk over. And so taking that together with a sort of perimeter nav mesh, we could, with using this export tool button, we could generate the environment colliders automatically. So it would not only bake the nav mesh, it would also do a couple of other things. And one of the nice important details here is that this export tool button is actually, of course, part of a class that I wrote, but it's a class that that extends the default, a built-in class. And this is, I think, a very powerful concept that you can take any built-in class in the editor, you can add your script to it, and then just add one button to it. And that's, I think, a very powerful, empowering tool, way to make tools. The same concept that we use as the tool was with printing some enemy uses per scenario. This seems like a very silly tool, but sometimes you just need to create this overview of the things that you've created, especially if you're working in a commercial game project. Sometimes you have this much content and you need to create some sort of overview. And if the data is hidden inside, maybe a dozen or 24 files, scripting it can be a solution, and that's also really where the export tool button comes in handy. You just write a simple function that loops over some of the data and prints it in the way that gives you the overview that you need. So, yes. A major downside of the export tool button is that you need to add tool to the top of the script. And what that means is that the script will get lifecycle events, as you call them, things like ready and enter tree and exit tree. It will all also happen in the editor. And that's a very important concept because that has an effect on your scripts.
Yeah, for example, we ran into some issues where I would just all of a sudden throw in an export variable that would adjust the position on ready, but I forgot that this was a tool script. So whenever we duplicated that node to create another object somewhere, it would just start teleporting around in the editor, and we couldn't figure out why for a while until we're like, oh yeah, of course, it was a tool script. But here's another example of where you would have to get different things based on whether or not you're at runtime or in the editor and so on. This specific example, we use a singleton to get our level instance of the level that is running at runtime. But in the editor, we didn't have access to that instance, so we use editor interface get edited scene root. So that would just be the root of the scene that happens to be open. But that is not exposed when you actually run it, when you actually export it. So it would crash the game because it didn't recognize editor interface as a thing that it could operate on. So then we used to use this third one, which is a bit of a mouthful, but yeah, to be able to get the singleton in order to and do it that way so you don't run into errors.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more that can go wrong here. Bugs, performance loops, crashing the editor, all those kinds of things. Yeah, you really need to understand that if you introduce the add tool, you're affecting two environments, the editor and the runtime. Okay, so small tip if you're getting started with these tool buttons. If you change any variable or property through this tool button, make sure to call notify property list changed afterwards. This is a function that you can call on any, I believe, resource or every node. If you call this after you've changed one of the properties, the system will know that you've changed something and you need to save, and it will update in the inspector and whatnot. So yeah, small tip. Okay, next up, inspector plugins. this button that we talked about, it's very easy, it's very nice, but it's not always enough. You know, sometimes you need to put a label, and sometimes you need to put something custom on top of the default inspector. And these editor inspector plugins is the solution. They are class specific, so they only show up in the inspector for objects that you defined. And then you can add stuff on top of it. So buttons, labels, any control really. And not just on top of nodes, but also if you're inspecting a resource. One example of that is in Riff. We had enemy waves, and we would have these waves built using some data structure with waves and then spawns and etc. But building these waves was actually quite complicated. And we ended up adding labels in between the buttons and all the default elements, and adding extra buttons so we could better design the waves. And yeah, these are slightly more advanced to make, but yeah, they give you all the tools that you need to improve your workflow. And actually, in truth, we haven't really explored the editor inspector tools much more beyond that. We just haven't felt the need as strongly with all the other options that are there. But you know, once you're past the boilerplate, it is just much more powerful than export tool button. I think that's the takeaway here. So the theoretical upside is that with this editor inspector plugin, whereas with the export tool button, you need to have this add tool at the top. In theory, you don't necessarily need it for the inspector plugin. However, in practice, it turns out we ended up putting this add tool at the top of our scripts after all, because if you want to run any function or you have getters and setters, they still need an instance to run on. So you know, there are still ways around this, but generally speaking, we found it just easier to add the add tool for the scripts that we were applying these custom inspectors to. So yeah, a little bit of a weird balancing of complexity there.
Yes, so as we're going to go into tool panels and looking at more complex examples, here's a nice reminder is that you can actually make your controls inside of Godot. So any tool interface that you're creating, you don't have to hard code it or anything like that. You could just like you'd make your UI scene in your game using control nodes. You can make it for your tool panel. That's actually how the Godot editor is made, using the same system, which allows you to manipulate it in ways in the editor in all kinds of weird and wonderful ways. There's actually a plugin called the Godot Editor Debugger, which lets you inspect all the live editor nodes, which is a bit weird and finicky, but it gives you a massive insight to how the editor and all the elements are structured. Now, we talked about the button a lot, but sometimes you don't want to push a button. You want to do something quicker. So there's shortcuts you can also use to basically launch your code. And this is an example of a reparenting shortcut. We basically mapped A and D so our designers could click on something and then reparent it to another node that intersects with it. So what they're doing right now is just going through all the options. And as you see, the flashes of light that indicates which node is the new parent. So it allows them to move quite quickly. Yep. Yeah, and we just made a panel to list all the shortcuts here as well, and all the various things that we've done. So we've done quite a few other ones, like toggling Z index between 0 and -1 quickly with a push of a button and that kind of thing. There's also undo redo. So you see that in Godot normally. You move something, you do Control Z, and it moves itself back. And there's a little note at the bottom. So you can set that up for all of your custom tools as well. Which basically follows the structure. You have undo, redo, create an action, and then you add what you want to happen or what is happening, and then you also add what happens when you do the undo, and then you commit it. So it's a bit more verbose, but then you have the undo and redo that follows the undo, redo hierarchy as it would in Godot with all the other things. Now, this is an example of how everything is just a bunch of control nodes. So this is kind of a pretty hacky way of getting the focus of the 2D viewport, which was needed. So when we were doing those shortcuts, obviously I wouldn't want the shortcuts to activate when I'm coding, and I had the code space focused, because then I'd be reparenting all kinds of nonsense while I'm typing stuff in. So this basically allowed it to detect whether or not the actual 2D viewport was focused and only allow the shortcuts to work during that time. Yeah, so tool panels is one of the final things. It's a full-blown editor plugin. It's like the big brother of the export tool button. Yeah, let's go to the next one. So here's an example of where we created what we call the hierarchy tool. So it's an entire panel, just like your inspector or your scene tree, and you can set it up with all the buttons and so on. At the top there, you can see how I actually just build it out, just like I would build a normal UI in order to put together this thing, and then that is what appears in the panel. And we basically use this where you can select all your nodes, and they go in the selected column. You can save them, so they stick in the save column. You can double click on something and it'll automatically focus on that node in the scene tree. You can reparent things, replace things. This might seem like, why is this necessary? But bear in mind that with our project, we have thousands of nodes in a single scene, so it gets really busy really quickly, so this helps us keep track of them. Another example, image tools. So our artist is basically drawing tens of thousands of these textures, and we need to turn them into little packed scenes with pivot points or little animations, so then he can do this like Lego building process of building the scene. So to be able to create those fundamental building blocks, now he just needs to click a couple textures in the scene tree and click a button, and then it creates the appropriate file. And then we have level-wide tools that basically are synchronizing a bunch of information. So this is a lot of stuff that could be done at runtime, but then it would require computational time to do it at runtime. So we just do it once at the beginning before we export. And yeah, it's a bunch of automation, basically. Yes, and you can also integrate with command line, which can be incredibly powerful. So in this particular case, we're using a third-party tool called Texture Packer, operating just using os.execute. So in that, basically, we are taking all of these individual textures that I mentioned, sending them to Texture Packer, which is packing it into a single sprite sheet, and then we're taking it back again in order to use texture atlases, which limits the number of draw calls we have for optimization.
So not every part of game development happens inside the editor. There's also a bunch of things that might happen outside of the editor, like exporting your project. So I don't know if you know about this Godot headless. It's a very, very nice way for if you want to streamline your export workflow. And here's what we did. This is a bash script, so it runs in terminal, or you can just double click it. And this, what I highlighted here, it makes Godot export the game to 3 platforms. In this case, macOS for Steam, Windows for Steam, and Linux for Steam. And the only thing I have to do is double click this thing, and it will automatically make the builds and even upload it to Steam. This is a bit of a reduced script because the original one is a lot more complicated because of notarization for macOS, but the idea is the same. You double click one script, it just exports everything, uploads it to Steam, and you don't really have to think about it anymore. I made this script maybe in 3 hours, and after that, I never really have to think about the whole uploading process anymore. So that is what we wanted to show you today. Obviously, there's a lot more that you can do. The documentation has many extensive tutorials that cover a lot more details than what we have today. So check them. And yeah, we are happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you. Hope it gave you some ideas. If you have questions, raise your hand and someone with a microphone will run to you. I see a couple of questions over here.
Yes, hi. I wonder if there is a way for, like, you know, the UI you get when you use the export at. So you get the UI to edit, for example, like dictionaries or whatever. Yeah. If there is a way to replicate it in other panels on the editor, like if I'm making a plugin, right? Because sometimes I've had to rebuild my own UI to look like the Godot UI is.
Yeah. The honest answer is I don't know. I mean, you could probably rewrite the entire panel, and including the drag and drop export field. You could do that, but it would be a lot of custom work. And again, I would go back to the first point I made during this presentation. Is that worth it? You know, because you might be able to find slight other ways to do it that, you know, still enable the workflow that you have in mind, that do not require you to rewrite the way that export variables work entirely. Yeah.
Hey, so the problem I had with tools is separating what happens at game runtime, in editor runtime, and just in editor. And what are the rules of thumb there? Like in Unity, you would have this like execute always or execute in edit mode. What are the equivalents in Godot for this to really split this cleanly?
Just the engine.
Yeah, go.
Yeah. We actually didn't mention it, I guess, but that is actually quite important. There is a engine.isEditor hint command. Basically, you can just throw that up. This is the simplest way that I've been using a lot. Basically, it just checks, are we in editor or are we running at runtime? And whenever I run into something that absolutely should not run in editor, I throw that up, or it absolutely should not run at runtime, then I throw that up.
Yeah, but there's a little bit more to that. There was one example that we shared. I'm just going to very quickly skip to it. That was this example, right? So here you can see that we're referencing the editor interface in the middle example. That's the kind of thing that you would put behind the engine.isEditor hint thing. However, if you export your game, that would still crash, right? So even though you can use this isEditor hint, you still have to export your game and see whether everything runs. And there's just no way around it. GDScript doesn't really have this sort of conditional compiling kind of things at this point, at least. So yeah, it's always going to be work. That's the honest truth. And you will, every time you add the add tools annotation, you'll have to go through all the lifecycle events that are already in the script and figure out, okay, does this fit in the editor? Does this fit in runtime? That's just what add tool does. Okay, another question?
First off, thanks for the talk. My question would be regarding the tools you showed for baking, for example, animations before your exports. Did you think about like using export plugins, or were you deciding against that since you, I think, are using the headless export and like doing it with the command line?
I mean, there were a lot of considerations, obviously. I think the most important one is that we knew precisely what we wanted. And if that's the case, then, and we know how to write a small custom script for it that we can keep lightweight and we know exactly how everything works, then there's honestly, if you can do it quickly, at the very least, there's no reason to search for another add-on, I would say. We could have gone down that road, but we didn't. Yeah.
Okay, because like generally I think if you can automate it so you don't have to think about like always clicking the baking buttons, I guess that would also keep a little bit of your head free for exporting.
It's your question is partly, of course, a workflow question, right? And in our case, we make the animation once, we click the button once, it generates a file that has all the animation data, and we never think about that ever again.
Yeah.
So in that sense, we don't necessarily need a whole plugin to do it every day 100 times. But of course, in other workflows, you might find something different. Yeah.
Thanks.
Another question up there.
For example, when you have can you bring up the bash script again, please? Yeah, exactly. So just I can see that you can execute different export presets. They call it presets.
Yep.
Export presets per export line.
Yep.
So I could imagine that you can, for example, if you have a dedicated server built for multiplayer games or whatever, you could theoretically export 2 Windows processes, one
Yep.
the dedicated. Okay, good.
You
I
get
did
it.
not have enough time to decipher exactly what that was. So
Empowered. You are now empowered.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk as well. This is for example, the best script is really cool. I did not know you could do that.
You're welcome. Any other questions? Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I'm just wondering if I could also add events to existing buttons. So instead of extending something to have a new button, I want to publish some event and listen to that from another object.
Yeah, I've done it. It's very finicky. We talked a little bit about the fact that the editor is also built with the same tools that you and I can just make now in control scenes. And using that, you can inspect all the objects, figure out precisely what object you want, and subscribe to any signals that are part of that. However, it's finicky, and the reason that I say that is because the editor will often rebuild itself. It will often change. If you, for instance, the inspector window, if you click on another object, the whole inspector panel is completely rebuilt. So it's finicky in that sense. But yeah, there's people that, for instance, add a tool script that then subscribes to the run button. And then when you click the run button, then first they execute some script and then they play the game, for instance. That's one example. But yeah, you can do that. And the only thing that you need to do for that is inspect the editor, figure out which node to get. And there's this function, I believe it's called editor interface.get root or something. There's something along those lines. And then you could just traverse the node hierarchy, find the node you want, subscribe to the signal you want with the editor plugin that you wrote, and then do whatever you want. Yeah.
Cool, thanks.
Any other questions? Last one. Yeah. Down here.
Thank you for this talk. So I have a question about undo redo, because I tried to use it on a non-editor plugin tool, and it just didn't work. I found many threads about it, but no solution. So you said at the beginning we should try to avoid making an editor plugin if not necessary. And I'm already working on an existing plugin, which is called Animated Speech to Animation Player. But the person doesn't have time to maintain it anymore. So I have to basically take it over, and I don't really want to totally revamp it just to add undo redo, which is important because it's not just to undo, but also to I need to save my changes after updating the animation. And currently, if you don't do anything special, you can press a button. There are changes. You close Godot. There's absolutely no prompt that you are discarding changes.
Yeah, there is secretly a lot of complexity in undo redo. We made a very simple example here. The example that we had, I'm not going to scroll to it, but the example that we had, you just essentially add the property and then it will just go flip the data in that case. That was a very simple example. There's also another method where instead of giving the undo redo the data that needs to be flipped, you pass it a function. But then there's one more layer of complexity, which is that the undo redo has different contexts. And that might be very relevant to you. Of course, I don't know all the specifics of the issue that you're encountering, but I do know that there's like an editor context, there's a scene specific, and there's all sorts of context that, if you're working in one context and you hit Control-Z, it might not actually end up trying to Control-Z in that specific context. So there's complexity there. I don't know all the details. Maybe you know more.
Not about that, but I think you said that you were trying to avoid using the editor plugin. we actually did only use the editor plugin, I think, for our undo redo examples, at least the ones I did. So I can't really speak to using it outside of the editor plugin as well, unfortunately.
Okay, so all your tool buttons are things I think that didn't need undo, like baking. So I suppose you didn't encounter the issue.
Yeah, so yeah, all the tools that were not in an editor plugin, we took the sacrifice of not having undo, or we just never bothered. It's been a little intermittent, admittedly, of when we would actually apply it. Like when it's stuff that where you can easily make a mistake with, like with the keystrokes, when it's very simple to just like push D too many times and you want to undo it, then of course it makes more sense. But when we're doing like clicking a button to synchronize everything, there's no reason to undo it because you just click it again and it starts from scratch and does it again. You just click it again and that would be like your redo kind of thing.
So in my case, I suppose just force saving is the best solution.
Maybe, of course, it depends on your specifics. We don't know those. But we certainly play fast and loose with this. Like at the end of the day, you have a specific need, and you try to find a way around it, yeah. And maybe it could also be that you're running into a bug. So try to figure out, maybe make a reproducible project, share it with Godot contributors, and maybe they will be able to either tell you that you're doing something in a different way, or maybe it's an actual bug. Yeah. Good luck.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, that's it. Thank you, everyone.